Growing up in Athens, Georgia, Margot Bennett knew her career goal was to serve and keep the peace.
I became a police officer, and a friend of mine said, you should try for the FBI. That's where I really found my niche. And it gave me the satisfaction of knowing I was doing something good.
In the winter of 1982, while 29-year-old Margot was finishing up her FBI field training in Atlanta, she met another new recruit, Gene Bennett.
My colleague said, Margot, I want to introduce you to Gene Bennett. Stay away from him. He'll try to get in your pants.
He had this swagger, very confident. He was already doing undercover work, which was almost unheard of. So he was a boy wonder.
In a single night working undercover, Gene helped bring down dozens of criminals and recovered more than $8 million in smuggled goods. The FBI was impressed. And so was Margot.
It is not something that just anyone can do. He had really taken to the work, and he was very successful.
So Gene asked her out, and she initially tried to say no, and he was just very persistent.
Almost instantly, the sparks started flying. But soon Margot was transferred to Kansas City. After 2 years of long-distance dating, she knew there was only one way the agency would bring them back together.
Gene and I broached the topic of marriage. I pretty much said to Gene, okay, now's the time. We're either going to do this or we're not. And so I guess you could say that I proposed to him.
In the winter of 1984, Margot and Gene tied the knot in a huge church wedding in Atlanta.
I had no doubt that Gene was the person I was meant to marry, that we were going to have a great future.
She was just really thrilled to be with Gene, and Gene was thrilled to be with her, and it looked like they were going to live happily ever after.
For the next 2 years, life flew by for the FBI's golden couple. But one day in September of 1986, while Margot was 8 months pregnant, Gene approached her with an idea for a scam.
He said he was just talking to his informant, and that his informant had this great idea, and it involved using the relocation service to make a profit on a house.
The FBI helps agents relocate by paying them the equity in their house and then selling the house for them.
The idea was that we would assume ownership of a home that the informant had recently purchased, as if we had lived there, and used that house to sell in the relocation service.
Gene told Margot they would split the profits with the informant.
My response to it was that his informant was nuts, that it was crazy, that there's no way we would do that.
Gene let the idea go. A month later, Margot gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and life seemed back on track.
Gene was a great dad. He was the first one to change her diapers. He doted on her.
But little did Margot know that this proud father would become her mortal enemy. 10 years down the road, Margot and Gene would face off in a scene straight out of a best-selling crime novel. It all started on June 23, 1996, with a late-night phone call.
My pastor came on the phone, and he said that he needed my help, that there were members of the congregation, a married couple, that were having a domestic dispute.
Around 11:30, Margot rushed to the church.
I pulled in, everything was dark, and got out and walked up to the front door. All of a sudden, the sanctuary door flew open, and this figure came out wearing a ski mask. He had a gun.
Margot had walked into a trap set by her very own husband.
And I knew right away it was Gene. I knew I was going to die.
In October of 1986, 10 years before FBI agent Margot Bennett found herself caught in her husband's trap, she and Gene were preparing to move to Washington, D.C. with their baby daughter.
My job was to do background investigations on court appointees. Jean's job was to do background investigation on White House appointees. It was a prestigious position.
But just before the move, Jean brought up the home relocation scam again. This time, he would not back down.
I didn't want to do it, and Jean's response was, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
To save her marriage, Margot went through with the scam, but it wasn't the payday Jean expected.
Jean had been hoping to make $100,000 on this house, but he ended up with only $17,000.
When the couple left for D.C. in January of 1987, Margot hoped it would end there.
I felt that once we moved, Jean would get on a different path than the one he was on.
That spring, Margot was offered her dream job, a teaching position at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She was thrilled. But once again, her husband became involved in shady deals on the side.
One of the rings that Jean had given me was a gold coin that had diamonds around the face of it, and it was not comfortable while I was typing, so I took it off and I put it in my purse in a little pouch.
Oddly, when Margot looked for her ring a couple days later, it was gone.
When I went to tell Jean that I had lost the ring, I really thought he was going to be upset about it, but instead he told me that our insurance would cover it.
Without blinking, Jean filed a claim and received a check for almost $12,000. The following Christmas, he surprised Margot with an identical ring, familiar scratch marks and all.
I was worried that this was the same ring that we had gotten an insurance payment on. I didn't know it for a fact, but my heart sunk.
By the time their second daughter was born in January of 1989, the distance between the couple had grown.
I was hoping that with this other child, our family would become more complete, and that it would be a way of pulling us back into where we were.
But it wasn't meant to be.
He enjoyed the undercover work. He enjoyed pretending to be a criminal. He enjoyed that so much that it was starting to seep into his life.
By the summer of 1990, after 6 years of marriage, Margot had had enough. But she wasn't ready to break her family apart.
I was telling myself that when the girls graduate from high school, I'll do something about this. I'll wait 10 years. I'll wait, and I'll just be unhappy for 10 years.
Margot stayed in the marriage, but in June of 1991, her love life took a surprising turn. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwall had come to Quantico to research her new book.
When I was getting to know Patricia, I called her Patsy. We would get together for lunch. We would spend some time together, and she came to my house for dinner on a couple of occasions.
Soon, Margot sensed an attraction between them, and it wasn't long before their friendship became something more.
I began to sense a different kind of closeness from her. It was something that was missing in my life. It's almost like I was a dry sponge, and she was throwing water on it.
By April of 1992, Margot and Patsy were getting closer and closer. But with her unfinished business at home, Margot couldn't go on with the affair.
We agreed we should stop this and just be friends, and that's what we did.
But the affair changed Margot's outlook on her marriage, and 2 months later, she told her husband she wanted a divorce and temporary custody of the girls.
Gene was stunned. I don't believe he thought I was heading in that direction. He told me he was okay with me moving into an apartment, but the kids weren't coming with me.
And at that point, she realized it's going to be all-out war.
So Margot went to the FBI and told them all about Gene's house fraud scam. In March of 1993, Gene and 2 of his accomplices were arrested and charged with 2 counts of fraud.
I felt like a heaviness about me because I was going to be very involved in the case. I was going to be testifying against my children's father.
By June, Margot was prepared to take the stand. But 5 days before the trial, Gene had another plan in store for Margot.
He absolutely flipped.
She was isolated, hands and feet taped.
And I realized that I might not live through this.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On June 19, 1993, 5 days before his trial for fraud, Margot Bennett's estranged husband Gene had the children for the weekend. He asked Margot to pick them up at 7 in the morning.
I pulled down in the driveway and got out of the car. The garage door came up and he was carrying their book bags. When he got close to me, he dropped the book bags.
That's when Margot realized she'd walked into a trap.
I saw that he had a taser in his hand. Through my head was going, get out, get out, get out, get out right now. And I took off running. He caught me and pulled me back into the garage. He was wrestling to hold me down, and I was fighting for my life.
Margot was quickly overcome.
Gene was using the taser on me, on my head. I gave up. I couldn't fight. I couldn't fight it any longer.
He gagged her and blindfolded her and stuck her into the trunk of her own car.
I was trying to figure out how am I going to get out of this. I was praying to just find a way out.
After driving for nearly an hour, Gene opened the trunk and delivered a bombshell.
He said, here's the deal. They've got the girls.
Gene told Margot that their kids were being held hostage by his accomplices until she agreed to change her testimony.
He made her think that they were in this together, that they had to fight the kidnappers.
He said that if I could convince them that I could get on the stand and lie and be credible about it, that they were willing to let me do that. I told him I could do it.
Gene held Margot captive until it was time for her to testify 5 days later. On June 24th, Margot stunned prosecutors when she took the stand and reversed her testimony. When the judge called a recess, Margot phoned her good friend John Hess.
There was a sense of almost panic in her voice, and which she just blurted out that she had been in the clutches of Gene. She was still concerned that maybe he had been telling her the truth about her children having been kidnapped. And I said, for heaven's sake, Margot, you know that's not true. He's lying. You have got to tell the truth.
Margot told her attorney what had happened, and soon learned that her kids had been staying with Gene's babysitter the whole time.
Kidnapping was not brought up.
My response was, it sounds like my life really wasn't worth a whole lot to know he was getting a year. I ended up resigning and leaving. I used the time that Gene was gone to heal emotionally as much as I could.
In March of 1995, Gene was released, but Margot couldn't break free from him. They still shared joint custody of their girls, and Margot feared he wasn't finished with her yet.
After he got out, I got a job at police department. I never went anywhere without a can of pepper spray and my gun. Mentally, I was just keeping myself on alert. I knew that he was going to come back. I just knew it.
When their custody battle for the kids got underway, Gene snapped once again. On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot was summoned to her church by the pastor. She entered the church expecting a domestic dispute, but instead found herself with a gun to her head.
I knew right away it was Gene.
This time, she was ready for him. She had her pepper spray, she had her gun, and this time, she was on her game.
And so I dove into the pastor's office. I went around the corner of his desk, Jean kept trying to come in the room.
Margot reached into her purse for her gun, but as she looked up, she saw that Jean had raised the stakes.
Margot saw her minister in the next room with a bag over his head, handcuffed to his chair, and a bag of explosives around his waist. And Jean said, "Do you want to die? Do you want us all to die?"
I realized that he was not going to quit. He was not going to go away. And I told myself, I'm going to have to shoot. I'm going to have to shoot him to get us out of this. And the next time Jean popped his head around the corner, I fired.
On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot Bennett fired a bullet straight at her estranged husband, Gene.
I missed him. I missed him by just a fraction, but it was enough to let him know that I was willing to take that shot. He backed off. I was yelling at Gene to leave, just go. Things got really quiet.
Margot called 911 and police arrived within minutes. But Gene was gone.
When we went outside the church, they cut the fanny pack off of the pastor's waist, and ultimately we learned that it was Play-Doh.
And it didn't take long for officers to track Gene down.
He went home back to his house and independently called 911 to report that Margot was trying to kill him.
His home surrounded, Gene refused to come out, and he turned up the drama on his 911 call.
As part of this crazy, elaborate scheme, he had come up with this idea that he had been an undercover for so long that his brain had split. His psyche had developed this new person named Evil Ed, who had come up with this crazy plan to kill Margot.
After a 4-hour standoff, Gene finally surrendered. But even in custody, Gene wasn't done trying to destroy Margot. This time in the media, exposing the Patricia Cornwall affair.
He hated me because it was my fault. In his mind, it was my fault he went to prison. It was my fault he lost his career with the FBI. I was going to pay for that.
In January 1997, Gene went to trial, but his temporary insanity defense didn't hold up.
He was not insane. Insanity, from a legal standpoint, means you don't know right from wrong, or you're incapable of controlling your actions. And the jury didn't buy that.
Gene Bennett was found guilty of 9 charges, including abduction and attempted murder. Although the jury recommended 61 years behind bars, the judge sentenced him to only 23.
The judge felt because of Gene's military service and because of his stellar career in the FBI that there was still some positive about him and that he deserved the opportunity to have another chance.
In the summer of 1997, Margot and Gene's divorce became final. Margot got full custody of the kids.
I was very relieved. The kids and I could pull our lives back together. We could make a future for ourselves, and we didn't have to worry about that anymore.
Today, 15 years later, Margot lives near her daughters in California and is enjoying life as a grandmother.
The events of my life certainly have shaped who I am today. They have made me realize that there's a core in me that won't crumble, that I am stronger than I think.
Margot hasn't spoken to Gene since his arrest, but knows the day will come when she will have to deal with him once more.
I am not going to waste precious time worrying about that. It means that I've given up, and I'm not going to give up. I'm not giving up.
Relationships are never easy. But for Diane Beasley, romance seemed to be one hard knock after another.
I was brought up to think that you get married, you have kids, and you live happily ever after. And I went through a couple marriages trying to live happily ever after, and that never happened.
After 3 divorces, Diane wasn't expecting a fairy tale. So in the summer of 1998, when a coworker introduced her to the new guy in town, she kept an open mind, even though John Smith wasn't quite her cup of tea.
No, his looks weren't the deal for me, at all.
John had just moved from Ohio to California. The few people who knew him saw a warm, yet solitary guy.
I felt sorry for him because he seemed so lonely and all he did was work 6, 7 days a week. He came across with a warm, good heart. That's what I liked about him.
John was dedicated to his job at a high-end car manufacturer. Diane loved fast cars and big engines. So when John asked her out to dinner, she agreed to go.
They had a great dinner, and next thing I knew, things were moving forward pretty fast.
Before long, Diane and John were sharing intimate details of their pasts.
A week and a half into it, I said, I'm divorced. I've been married a few times. And he says, I've been married twice, too.
John told Diane his first marriage ended in divorce. And sadly, his second ended in tragedy.
He says, my last wife died of cancer. And of course I said, oh, how sad.
He was having a very difficult time in life because of his wife.
But after just 6 weeks with Diane, John seemed ready to put his grief behind him. And he surprised her with a proposal.
And I kind of went, well, that's kind of soon.
Diane was very candid about saying I wasn't attracted to him, but he could help me. He could settle down my life. He could give me something I don't have right now, so why not?
That September, Diane married John Smith in front of an intimate group of friends and family.
Diane looked absolutely stunning, and a lot of smiles that day. You could tell that they were one happy couple.
I was going to do whatever I needed to do to make it last.
It was a fresh start for the couple. But when Diane moved in with John, she realized that he hadn't entirely left his past behind him.
When I moved in, he was already living there, and there was this huge picture of Fran on the wall. He said, do you want me to remove it? And I said, no, that's fine. I said, that's part of your past. And he said, thank you. And that was the end of it.
And for a while, that was the end of it.
This is a new beginning for me and John.
But Diane's newlywed bliss would come to a screeching halt only 8 months later. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was busy at her secretarial job when she had some surprise visitors.
Half an hour after I sat down, these guys came in suits, which is very odd for where I work. Usually everybody's in jeans. And I said, may I help you? And they said, are you Diane Smith? I said, yes.
The men were from the FBI, and they had a pointed question for Diane.
They asked me what John had told me about Fran, and I said he told me that his wife died of cancer.
And that's when the FBI dropped a bombshell. They told Diane that John's second wife, Fran, had not died of cancer. And his first marriage didn't end in a simple divorce.
I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
What really happened was far, far worse.
I could not believe it. I did not believe it.
How is he able to get away with so many horrible things for so many years?
In September of 1998, 8 months before a devastating visit from the FBI, Diane Beasley was enjoying her new marriage to John Smith.
We were doing a lot of sightseeing because he'd never been out here. I'm a native San Diegan.
They were always on the go. They loved to go to the beach and go for walks on the beach.
My life with John at that time was almost picture perfect.
But for Diane, there was one thing that could make the picture even prettier. A bigger home. Luckily, money was no object for John.
His family had real estate holdings, they had apartments. He'd never lacked for finances.
Before long, the couple found a place they liked and applied for a lease. But soon after submitting the application, Diane got a disturbing phone call from an apartment manager.
The apartment manager said, "You need to come here. I need to show you something." And I said, "What's the problem? Just tell me over the phone." And she said, "No, you need to see this." And I went, uh-oh.
Diane raced to the rental office, and when she arrived, the apartment manager had a copy of John's credit report. The results were jaw-dropping.
She showed me the credit report, which was 10 pages long of stuff that he hadn't paid. He had houses that he hadn't paid taxes on. They were in foreclosure. He had credit cards that he'd never paid. It was just terrible.
By the time John got home from work that evening, Diane was beside herself.
I said, "We can't even rent a place because of your credit."
But John had an explanation. He claimed the troubled properties really belonged to a relative.
He said, "I had to take them over, and I couldn't afford them."
John promised Diane he would fix everything.
He said that he can buy a house outright with cash. And he said, we'll just do that, you know, while I get this credit of mine straightened out. I thought, okay, all right, we'll just have to stay in this little granny flat here for a little bit longer, and then we can go and buy a house outright.
Over the next couple months, Diane focused on her new marriage. But she wasn't pleased when she noticed that John often seemed more interested in the computer than in her.
He was always at that computer. Why can't he be doing it at work, which he had access to a computer?
Even more worrisome was John's strange reaction when Diane interrupted his work.
Whenever I would go up there looking for him, all of a sudden the computer went off. And I thought, that's kind of odd, you know?
As the weeks went on, Diane couldn't help but notice how often John had to explain things away. Diane wondered if her new husband was hiding something, and she wasn't the only one. Her daughter Summer began to see a different side of John when she visited.
When I was home alone with him, he was very mad, angry. When he was out with my mom, he would talk really nice, be very sweet. And I used to tell my mom that. She kind of played it off, you know, I think you're just paranoid.
But by November of 1998, Diane was also baffled by John's furtive behavior. Too many details just didn't add up.
He didn't have a checking account. He had been out here for over a year and a half, and he was still resisting getting the California driver's license. I thought that was very odd.
It seemed like John Smith was trying to fly under the radar.
He was a man who, as ordinary as he was, always seemed to have this strange, dark, secretive side.
And Diane would soon learn there was a terrifying reason why.
He knew that around each corner were FBI agents surveilling him.
Something was fishy about this man. I was afraid he was going to snap big.
By January of 1999, just 4 months into her marriage, Diane Beasley was certain that something was off with her new husband, John Smith.
He was very agitated, and I got to getting kind of concerned.
By now, his behavior had gone from merely strange to chilling.
We were coming back from dinner, and I was in front of him in one of the cars, and he was behind me. And I could see him in my rearview mirror, banging on the steering wheel, talking to himself, screaming and yelling at himself. And I thought, who's this guy? You know, I don't know this guy. He was just having a fit all by himself.
John is a man who walked around with secrets. He walked around with all this darkness that he hid. I think Diane saw a glimmer of light clearly. You can't ignore something like this.
But John's unnerving behavior was just a glimpse of what was to come. The morning of May 5th, 1999, Diane was at work when 2 FBI agents paid her a visit. She was startled when they began to ask her questions about John's ex-wife, Fran, who Diane thought had died of cancer.
And then it all came out about John. They said, we're here for John Smith. We're investigating the murder of 2 of his wives. I was just absolutely flabbergasted.
The agents went on to explain that both of John's former wives had gone missing under suspicious circumstances.
The FBI was struck by the outrageous coincidences. This man was married twice, 2 missing wives. That just can't happen naturally.
By the time I got out of there, I was just dumbfounded. I was just shocked.
The story left Diane shaken, but she was determined not to believe a word of it until she heard John's side.
I couldn't believe this of John. John wasn't like this. They must have the wrong person.
And when John finally called her later that day, Diane was certain it was all a big mistake. Especially when she found out he had also been interrogated by the FBI and let go.
He was talking a mile a minute. He was very upset. He said the reason why he told me Fran died of cancer, he said because he didn't believe that Fran was missing. He think that she took off. He didn't want to shock me. He said that the first one, he told me the story about how he thinks a friend of hers killed her.
John claimed that he was being framed by the FBI for something he didn't do.
It was all conspiracy, and that's the reason why he left Ohio, because he couldn't get past any of this. It wasn't him.
At first, Diane believed her husband, but that was about to change. 2 weeks later, a special delivery letter addressed to Diane arrived in the mail.
Fran's sister wrote me a letter, and when I got it, it had a phone number on there for me to call her. And a couple days later, I did call her.
By the time Diane hung up the phone, her belief in her husband was shaken to the core.
The sister was telling me, we are convinced that John killed Fran. And she said, you're in danger of your life. Everything that the FBI told you is true.
Diane's focus immediately changed from being a supportive wife to just keeping herself alive.
I did what the FBI told me to do. When you start getting agitated when you're asking questions, quit right then. Don't irritate him.
Hammered him.
When Michael finally broke, he told detectives a horror story.
Michael told the police and the FBI about a wooden box he saw. A wooden box that his brother John had built and stored for years. And one day, Michael happened to open that box, and inside he saw the skeletal remains of John's former wife.
It was the break investigators had been waiting for. But there was one problem. Michael didn't know what had happened to the box.
It was brutal for Michael. He had nightmares about it. I think he was scared of John. He didn't want to end up in his own box.
For Diane, the news was horrifying. She just wanted to get out of her marriage alive. But leaving John Smith would not be easy. Diane was about to come face to face with the monster her husband truly was.
If Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By December of 1999, Diane Beasley had no doubt her husband, John Smith, was a murderer.
Real fear started to grip her. He's married 2 other women. One turned up dead in a box, the other one, we don't know where she is.
As soon as they found out what kind of person he is, they would leave him, and then they would be gone.
Determined not to be a third victim, Diane secretly went about getting her marriage annulled. On December 17th, John was served with papers. Anticipating the worst, Diane holed up in the apartment with her daughter, Summer. They changed the locks, hid the cars, and closed the blinds. And sure enough, John Smith arrived in a fury.
Summer was peeking out. She goes, "Here he comes."
He comes storming up, and it's like his face changed.
"Mom," she says, "he looks like a monster coming up here."
Diane immediately called 911.
We heard him pounding on the windows. You could hear his body being thrown up against the door. And then you could hear the door frame cracking.
He busted down the door. I didn't even recognize him. And as soon as he saw Summer, his whole demeanor had changed. "Baby, you don't need to do this. I don't want you to divorce me. I can explain everything." I knew right at that time, if Summer hadn't have been there, I'd been dead.
Diane survived the encounter, and John soon left the apartment. Meanwhile, armed with a shocking confession from John's brother Michael, detectives were on the hunt for the body of John's first wife, Janice Hartman.
In a desperate bid to try to find this body, the cops sent around a round of letters. And a policeman in Indiana was opening his mail one day and got this letter. Said, "Hey, did anybody find a body in a box?"
The grim question rang a bell.
One day in 1980, a road crew was working on this lonely pavement in the middle of an Indiana field when they came across a wooden box. They opened it up, and what was looking at them but the skeletal remains of a young woman.
The remains had never been identified, and the girl became known as the lady in the box. She was buried in a pauper's grave.
And this cop said, "I think we got your girl."
Investigators had the remains exhumed and tested, and when the results came back from the lab, the lady in the box was finally identified as Janice Hartman, John Smith's first wife. John's grisly secret had literally been unearthed.
I was devastated. I thought, this poor girl cut down by this monster, John.
On October 3, 2000, John Smith was arrested at work. At the trial 9 months later, Diane learned the extent of John's deceptions. All that time he'd spent on the computer wasn't just business, as he claimed. John was having multiple affairs.
So much of what police say John was motivated by was power, not money. It wasn't sex, it was power over these women. In the two cases in which his wives disappeared, the wives challenged him and crossed him. They took on his authority.
And that's when John Smith would snap.
John had lots of girlfriends, and so the fear is there are more than two missing Mrs. Smiths.
On July 19, 2001, John Smith was found guilty of murder in the case of Janice Hartman. He was sentenced to 15 years to life. Fran Gladden Smith, John's second wife, has never been found. It's been more than a decade since John Smith walked into her life, and Diane has closed the book on that unhappy chapter. But despite everything, Diane held fast to her belief in happily ever after. And 8 years ago, she found it in her new husband, Robert.
We have a new life together. We live here all by ourselves with visits from the kids and the grandchildren. So it couldn't be better. It's perfect.
Today, Diane surrounds herself with good friends and family. And she finally knows that happiness isn't just a fairy tale.
Yes, there is happily ever after, and I'm living proof of it.
When we think of a monster, we often picture something lurking in the shadows, something alien to our daily lives. We imagine a physical threat, a figure wielding a weapon in a dark alley. But the most terrifying monsters are rarely the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones standing in the broad daylight, clothed in the very symbols of protection we have been taught to trust since childhood. A police uniform is supposed to be a beacon of safety. It represents the shield between civilization and chaos, the promise that when you are in danger, someone bound by duty and honor will come to your rescue. But what happens when the person wearing that shield is the one creating the chaos? What happens when the authority granted by the state is twisted into an instrument of absolute terror? This is not a story about a violent murder. There are no bloody crime scenes, no mysterious disappearances, and no serial killers hunting in the night. Yet, the story we are about to explore is considered one of the most horrifying nightmares in the history of the local justice system. It is a horror rooted in the complete perversion of justice, a tale of what occurs when absolute power goes unchecked and a badge becomes a weapon of extortion. The year was 1994. The setting was American Samoa, a territory where community ties are deep and respect for authority is woven into the very fabric of society. In such a tight-knit community, a police officer is not just an anonymous enforcer of the law. They are a known entity, a figure of prominence whose reputation precedes them. Among these ranks was King Talamoni, a well-known and established police officer. Talamoni was not a rookie navigating the complexities of law enforcement. He was a man who understood the system, who knew how the gears of justice turned, and more importantly, he knew how much weight his word carried. In his uniform, he represented the unquestionable authority of the state. To the average citizen, an officer like Talamoni was someone to be respected, someone whose directives were to be followed without hesitation. On the other side of this dynamic was a citizen named Mata Talapaga. Talapaga found himself in a deeply vulnerable position, as he had become the subject of criminal allegations. Being under investigation by the police is a terrifying experience for anyone. It is a period of intense anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. The machinery of the justice system is vast and intimidating, and the individual often feels entirely powerless against it. When you are the target of an investigation, your fate rests in the hands of the officers assigned to uncover the truth. You rely on their integrity, their commitment to objective facts, and their adherence to the law. Talapaga was in this exact state of precariousness. He was waiting for the system to process his case, hoping for a fair and impartial investigation. The duty of conducting this investigation fell to Officer King Talamoni. Officially, his task was straightforward. He was supposed to gather evidence, interview relevant parties, and compile a factual report regarding the allegations against Talapaga. This is the bedrock of police work, the fundamental process that ensures justice is served fairly. An investigator must remain neutral, letting the evidence dictate the direction of the case. But Talamoni did not see a duty to uphold. He did not look at Talapaga and see a citizen entitled to due process. Instead, when Talamoni looked at the vulnerable, anxious man under his investigative purview, he saw an opportunity. He saw a perfect target for a calculated scheme of self-enrichment. Rather than executing his sworn duties, Talamoni began to construct an intricate and suffocating psychological trap. He realized that the immense power he held over Talapaga could be weaponized. The badge on his chest was not just a symbol of authority. It was a master key to terrorize a man who was already cornered by the legal system. Talamoni understood the psychology of a suspect under investigation. He knew the fear of incarceration, the dread of a ruined reputation, and the desperation to clear one's name. By exploiting these very human fears, Talamoni initiated a campaign of mental torment that would shatter Talapaga's sense of reality. The officer began to systematically dismantle the boundaries between law enforcement and criminality. He approached Talapaga not as an impartial investigator seeking the truth, but as a predator cornering its prey. Talamoni leveraged his official capacity, using the full weight of his uniform and his position within the department to isolate and intimidate his victim. He made it abundantly clear that he was in absolute control of Talapaga's destiny. The official investigation became a facade, a convenient cover for a dark, deeply corrupt agenda. Talamoni was no longer gathering facts. He was cultivating fear. Let us pause to consider the environment in which this nightmare unfolded. American Samoa in 1994 was geographically isolated, creating a unique societal structure. It is a place where generations of families have lived side by side, where reputations are built over decades and can be destroyed in an instant. In an island territory, there is nowhere to run. There is no neighboring state to flee to, no vast metropolitan anonymity to hide within. When you are entangled in a crisis here, it consumes your entire world. The community is your whole universe. Therefore, being accused of a crime in American Samoa carries a heavy social burden, a stigma that permeates every aspect of daily life. For Mata Talapaga, the initial criminal allegations would have already brought immense stress. He was already standing on unstable ground, facing the judgment of his peers and the daunting prospect of a legal defense. This was the fragile state of mind that King Talamoni encountered. Talamoni did not just exploit a legal loophole. He exploited a human being at their absolute lowest point. The officer observed a man drowning in anxiety and, instead of throwing a lifeline of fair process, he reached out and pushed him further under the water. The crime of corruption, specifically police extortion, is uniquely insidious because it operates under the guise of legitimacy. When Talamoni approached Talapaga, he did not do so in the shadows wearing a mask. He approached him in the stark light of day, wearing the uniform of the state, carrying the badge that signified his lawful authority. Every demand he made, every threat he whispered, was backed by the implicit threat of state violence. This is what legal scholars call acting under the color of law. It means the perpetrator is using the power granted to them by the government to commit their crimes. When a crime is committed under the color of law, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victim. It strikes at the very heart of civil society. We willingly surrender a portion of our freedom and grant certain individuals the power to use force, but we do so under the strict condition that this power will be used justly. King Talamoni took that sacred social contract and tore it to pieces. He demonstrated that the tools of justice could easily be transformed into instruments of personal greed. For Talapaga, the realization that the system itself was hunting him must have been a profoundly terrifying epiphany. Imagine the sheer psychological toll of this realization. Talapaga knew he was facing allegations, and he knew he needed to defend himself through the proper legal channels. But suddenly, the channel itself became the threat. If the police officer investigating you is the one demanding a bribe, who do you report it to? The police department? The very colleagues and friends of the man extorting you? The sense of helplessness would be absolute. Talamoni constructed an invisible prison around Talapaga long before any actual jail cell was involved. It was a prison built of fear, intimidation, and the suffocating weight of an unchecked authority. The psychological warfare employed by Talamoni was precise and relentless. He used his official status to ensure Talapaga felt completely trapped. Every interaction was steeped in the underlying threat of state-sanctioned violence, specifically the loss of freedom. Talamoni presented himself as the ultimate gatekeeper of Talapaga's future. The allegations hanging over Talapaga's head were merely the starting point. Talamoni took those allegations and amplified them, twisting them into a heavy chain that he wrapped tightly around his victim. As we prepare to uncover the specific tactics Talamoni used, the blatant extortion and the sheer audacity of his threats, we must keep in mind the perspective of the victim. Mata Talapaga was an ordinary citizen caught in a trap set by an apex predator of the legal system. The power imbalance was staggering, and the isolation must have been absolute. King Talamoni believed he was completely untouchable simply because he wore a police uniform. The descent into this case will reveal not just the actions of one corrupt officer, but the subsequent battle to bring him down, a battle that would shake the very foundations of the local justice system and expose a deeply entrenched network of complicity and abuse. This is the story of a badge turned against the public, a nightmare of extortion, and a desperate fight for accountability in a system determined to protect its own. The transition from a standard criminal investigation to a calculated campaign of extortion does not happen overnight. It is a methodical process of breaking down a subject, a deliberate escalation of pressure designed to strip away any remaining sense of security the victim might possess. For Mata Talapaga, the nightmare began not with an arrest warrant, but with the constant, suffocating presence of Officer King Talamoni. Talamoni understood that physical violence was entirely unnecessary when you have the power of the state at your disposal. The uniform itself was his weapon, and he wielded it with a chilling precision. He began to systematically inject himself into Talapaga's daily existence, ensuring that the target of his extortion never had a moment to breathe or to think clearly. The strategy was psychological warfare in its purest form. Talamoni used his official capacity to approach Talapaga repeatedly, turning every encounter into an agonizing reminder of the power imbalance between them. This was not a matter of an officer occasionally checking in on a suspect. This was a targeted campaign of harassment disguised as police work. Every time Talapaga saw the police cruiser approaching, every time he saw the badge gleaming on Talamoni's chest, his anxiety would spike, knowing that his life was entirely dictated by the whims of this corrupt official. Talamoni weaponized his authority to instill a profound sense of doom within Talapaga. He made it explicitly clear during their interactions that the criminal file, the very document that could destroy Talapaga's life, was resting firmly and securely in his own hands. He painted a picture of absolute certainty regarding the outcome of the investigation. Talamoni did not speak in probabilities or possibilities. He spoke in guarantees. He constantly reminded his victim that the path to prison was already paved and that the heavy iron doors of jail cell were waiting to slam shut behind him. The psychological toll of this constant threatening presence cannot be overstated. For an ordinary citizen, the prospect of incarceration is a source of unimaginable dread. It means the loss of freedom, the destruction of one's livelihood, and a permanent stain on one's reputation. Talamoni exploited this dread masterfully, twisting the knife with every interaction. He wanted Talapaga to feel as though the walls were rapidly closing in, leaving him with absolutely no escape route through conventional legal channels. The message was unmistakable and terrifyingly clear. The justice system was not going to save Talapaga, because in this specific scenario, Talamoni had positioned himself as the sole embodiment of that system, acting as investigator, judge, and executioner all at once. As the psychological pressure reached a boiling point, Talamoni finally revealed the true purpose behind his campaign of terror. The constant harassment, the looming threat of prison, and the psychological manipulation were all preamble to a blatant and sickening ultimatum. Talamoni laid his cards on the table, offering a way out of the suffocating trap he had meticulously constructed. The price for freedom, however, was steep and purely financial. The corrupt officer demanded a massive sum of cash, reaching into the thousands of dollars, a figure that represented an astronomical amount of money in the economic landscape of 1994 American Samoa. This was not a petty bribe or a minor shakedown. This was a catastrophic financial demand designed to drain the victim of his resources in exchange for his very life and liberty. Talamoni framed this extortion as a transaction, a twisted arrangement where he would guarantee the complete destruction of the criminal file and permanently bury the allegations in exchange for the cash. He presented himself as the only entity capable of halting the machinery of justice, offering to wipe the slate clean if the exorbitant ransom was met. The audacity of this demand highlights the profound depth of Talamoni's corruption. He was entirely comfortable commodifying the justice system, placing a literal price tag on a citizen's freedom. For Talapaga, the demand for thousands of dollars must have felt like a crushing weight. Raising such a substantial amount of cash discreetly, without drawing attention to the extortion, would be an agonizing challenge. Yet, the alternative presented by Talamoni was the complete destruction of his life. The concept of buying one's way out of a criminal charge strikes at the very foundation of societal order. It creates a terrifying reality where innocence or guilt becomes entirely irrelevant, replaced by a brutal calculation of who can afford to pay off the corrupt enforcers of the law. Talamoni was asking Talapaga to participate in the desecration of the justice system, forcing him to choose between financial ruin and personal annihilation. The officer's sheer confidence in making such a demand suggests a frightening level of comfort with corruption, hinting that he felt completely insulated from any potential consequences. He operated with the arrogant assumption that a frightened citizen would never dare to expose a respected police officer, relying on the inherent trust placed in the uniform to shield his criminal enterprise. However, the most horrifying aspect of this case, the element that elevates it from standard corruption to a nightmare of legal abuse, was the ultimate threat Talamoni leveled against his victim. He recognized that simply threatening to process the existing charges might not be enough to force Talapaga to surrender the massive sum of money. There was always a lingering chance that a court might find Talapaga innocent of the initial allegations, a possibility that threatened Talamoni's illicit payday. To completely eliminate any hope of a fair trial and to ensure absolute compliance, Talamoni deployed the most sinister weapon in a corrupt officer's arsenal. He explicitly stated that if the monetary demands were not met in full, he would not just proceed with the current case, but he would actively fabricate entirely new, fake evidence against Talapaga. This was the peak of his moral decay. It was a declaration that the truth had absolutely no bearing on his actions. If the reality of the situation did not support a harsh enough prison sentence, Talamoni was more than willing to invent a new reality that would guarantee Talapaga's destruction. The implications of this threat are profoundly chilling. When a law enforcement officer threatens to plant evidence, they are declaring absolute dominion over the life of a citizen. They are weaponizing the immense trust that the judicial system places in police testimony and physical evidence gathered by authorities. Talamoni knew exactly how the system functioned. He knew that in a courtroom, a police officer's word carries immense weight. If an officer presents evidence, a jury and a judge are naturally inclined to believe its authenticity. By threatening to manufacture evidence, Talamoni was telling Talapaga that fighting back was not merely difficult, but statistically impossible. He was guaranteeing that he would construct a case so airtight, so deeply laced with fabricated proof, that no defense attorney could unravel it. He promised to ensure that Talapaga would not just go to prison, but that he would receive the absolute maximum and harshest sentence permissible under the law. This was an act of profound malice, a calculated effort to strip away the last remaining shreds of hope and force the victim into complete submission through sheer, unadulterated terror. Imagine the psychological state of Mata Talapaga upon hearing this threat. He was already drowning in anxiety over the initial allegations and the massive financial demand. Now, he was faced with a reality where his actual actions, his actual innocence or guilt regarding the initial matter, were completely irrelevant. His fate was entirely untethered from reality and completely chained to the greed of King Talamoni. He was trapped in a nightmare where the very person tasked with finding the truth was actively promising to bury him in lies. The terror of knowing that an officer of the law is willing to commit perjury, forge documents, or plant illicit materials to secure your imprisonment is paralyzing. It shatters the fundamental assumption that the legal system is a mechanism for finding the truth. For Talapaga, the justice system had transformed into a monstrous machine, and Talamoni was the operator standing at the controls, explicitly threatening to crush him in the gears if he did not pay the toll. The cruelty of Talamoni's strategy lay in its absolute thoroughness. He attacked Talapaga from every conceivable angle. He used his physical presence to intimidate, his official authority to threaten the loss of freedom, his financial demands to threaten economic ruin, and finally, his willingness to fabricate evidence to completely extinguish any hope of a legal defense. Every avenue of escape was systematically blocked by the very uniform that was supposed to represent safety and order. The victim was left isolated, terrified, and facing a choice that was no choice at all. He had to somehow conjure a massive sum of cash to feed the greed of a corrupt officer, or face the certainty of a long, brutal, and entirely fabricated prison sentence. The sheer weight of this situation creates a deep well of empathy for the victim, an ordinary person caught in the terrifying grip of a predator disguised as a protector. The descent into this darkness reveals the terrifying vulnerability of any citizen when the safeguards of justice fail, and a police badge becomes an instrument of absolute, unchecked extortion. This was the grim reality that Mata Talapaga endured, a silent and desperate struggle against a man who believed himself to be completely above the law he was sworn to uphold. The turning point of this harrowing ordeal arrived when the weight of the extortion finally became impossible to bear in silence. For Mata Talapaga, the realization had fully taken root that there was no way out of this trap that did not involve the destruction of his own future. The demand for thousands of dollars was not a path to safety, but merely the first step into a bottomless well of corruption. Every dollar paid would only deepen his entanglement with Officer King Talamoni, cementing his status as a perpetual source of income for a predator who would never truly stop. When the internal pressure reached its limit, the secrecy that had sustained the extortion finally fractured. The details of the scheme, the relentless threats of fabricated evidence, and the corrupt demands for payment were brought to the attention of the authorities, specifically the office that held the power to disrupt such institutional rot. The report triggered an immediate and profound crisis within the American Samoa justice system. It was not merely a criminal complaint against an individual officer. It was an existential threat to the integrity of the entire law enforcement apparatus on the island. When the Attorney General's office initiated the investigation into Talamoni, they were stepping into a minefield. The investigation was not going to be a clean, straightforward prosecution of a rogue cop. It was destined to be a confrontation between the forces of order and a shadow network of influence that had long operated in the background. The moment the formal process began, the system reacted in a way that revealed just how deeply the cancer had spread. The Office of the Attorney General faced an immediate and intense backlash. They were not just fighting a single corrupt officer. They were fighting the invisible walls of a support structure that had protected Talamoni for years. The legal battleground shifted from the specific facts of the extortion into a far more complex and dangerous territory. The defense mounted on behalf of Talamoni was not merely a series of legal arguments regarding his innocence. It was a strategic mobilization of power. The goal was not necessarily to prove that Talamoni did not commit the crime, but to ensure that the investigation itself could never reach a definitive conclusion. As the legal proceedings commenced, the courtroom became a stage for a desperate, high-stakes battle of influence. The defense attorneys for Talamoni moved with a calculated aggression, attempting to dismantle the credibility of the prosecution's case from the outset. They sought to inject doubt into every facet of the investigation, challenging the validity of the evidence, the conduct of the investigators, and the reliability of the witnesses. However, the most disturbing tactic involved the active recruitment and intimidation of witnesses. It became clear that the defense was not acting in a vacuum. They were leveraging personal connections, political favors, and the lingering fear of the accused to create a shield around him. Witnesses who could have provided testimony crucial to proving the pattern of extortion found themselves under immense pressure. Some were approached by figures of influence who suggested that it would be in their best interest to keep quiet, while others were made to feel that testifying against a veteran officer would result in social or professional consequences that they were not prepared to face. This period of the case was an absolute nightmare for the prosecution. Every step they took was met with obstruction. Documents that should have been readily available were suddenly misplaced or delayed. Interviews were tainted by the intervention of third parties who sought to coach or threaten those providing statements. The courtroom atmosphere was suffocating, characterized by constant delays, motions to dismiss, and sharp, volatile exchanges between the defense and the attorneys representing the government. The legal team tasked with bringing Talamoni to justice found themselves working in a hostile environment, constantly looking over their shoulders to see who was pulling the strings in the background. The case began to feel like a siege, where the defense was holding the line against the truth, protected by the very institutions that should have been facilitating the pursuit of justice. It was an exhausting, slow-moving grind that tested the resolve of every individual involved in the prosecution. The involvement of high-ranking officials and prominent members of the community in the defense strategy raised grave questions about the reach of Talamoni's influence. It was not just about protecting one man. It was about protecting a system where such corruption had been allowed to flourish unchecked. The courtroom arguments turned into a series of strategic maneuvers where the legal merits of the case were frequently overshadowed by the sheer noise of the political and social pushback. The prosecution had to navigate a landscape where every witness and every piece of evidence was scrutinized under a microscope by a defense team determined to discredit them. They had to battle the narrative that Talamoni was being unfairly targeted, a narrative that resonated with those who relied on the existing power structures for their own benefit. The tension was palpable. The community watched as the very mechanism intended to deliver justice struggled to breathe under the weight of institutional interference. The struggle at the heart of this case was a battle for the soul of the justice system. The Attorney General's office was forced to confront the reality that to convict Talamoni, they had to prove more than just his guilt. They had to break through the armor of silence and complicity that kept him secure. This required an extraordinary amount of diligence and persistence. The prosecutors had to meticulously document every instance of intimidation, every failed subpoena, and every attempt at witness tampering. They were effectively building a case within a case. The primary charge of extortion and the secondary, equally dangerous reality of judicial obstruction. The courtroom became a pressure cooker, where the truth was slowly being extracted through sheer force of will, despite the desperate attempts of the defense to bury it. Every session was a display of technical, legal, and psychological combat. The defense tried to paint the witnesses as unreliable, using the stress of their ordeal to claim their memories were flawed. They attempted to reframe Talamoni's actions as a misunderstanding, a legitimate investigation that simply went off the rails, rather than a calculated, predatory scheme. But the prosecution remained anchored to the evidence of the extortion, the specific threats, the demands for cash, and the direct, terrifying warnings about fabricated evidence. They held onto the narrative of the victim, Mata Talapaga, whose life had been turned upside down by a man who was supposed to protect it. They kept the focus on the central, unassailable fact that a police officer had demanded money in exchange for his silence and had promised to ruin an innocent man's life if he did not comply. The delay tactics and the constant barrage of objections from the defense only served to highlight the desperation of their position. If Talamoni were truly innocent, there would have been no need for such a chaotic, all-out effort to disrupt the judicial process. The very intensity of the interference was, in its own way, an admission of guilt. The community could see it, the judge could see it, and the prosecutors worked tirelessly to ensure that the jury saw it too. The trial became a test of endurance, a long, arduous march toward a final reckoning that many feared would never arrive. It was a period where the foundational trust between the citizen and the state in American Samoa was hanging in the balance, stretched to the point of snapping. The case had transformed from a local incident into a symbolic battleground for the rule of law itself, representing the struggle against the dark reality that even the most trusted symbols of authority can become the most effective tools of predation when they are allowed to operate in the shadows of an unmonitored, deeply entrenched system of influence. The investigation phase of the King Talamoni case was a masterclass in the slow, agonizing friction between the pursuit of truth and the entrenched mechanisms of institutional preservation. As the Attorney General's office moved to peel back the layers of deception surrounding the extortion of Mata Talapaga, they encountered an environment that felt less like a standard criminal inquiry and more like a high-stakes intelligence operation. Each step taken by the investigators was monitored, challenged, and often sabotaged by an internal network designed to prioritize the protection of one of their own above the fundamental requirements of justice. The prosecutors quickly realized that they were not merely investigating an incident of bribery. They were dismantling a complex web of intimidation that had allowed Talamoni to operate with impunity for years. The sheer audacity of the officer's behavior had blinded the department to his true nature, or worse, had fostered an atmosphere where such behavior was viewed as an unfortunate but acceptable byproduct of the job. The investigation required a level of meticulousness that pushed the capabilities of the small, local justice apparatus to their absolute limit. Every piece of communication, every log of police activity, and every statement made by colleagues was scrutinized to determine where the boundaries of Talamoni's authority ended and his criminal enterprise began. The investigators had to navigate the delicate challenge of questioning police officers who were either Talamoni's close associates or colleagues who were terrified of being implicated in the same culture of corruption. This created a profound sense of paranoia within the department. The investigators had to verify their leads in complete secrecy, knowing that any leak could potentially alert the defense team and result in the destruction of evidence or the silencing of key witnesses. The emotional burden on the investigators was immense, as they were tasked with uncovering the rot within their own ranks, effectively forcing them to betray the bonds of professional brotherhood in the service of a higher ethical duty. One of the most critical aspects of the investigation was the verification of the victim's narrative. Mata Talapaga, though terrified, became the anchor of the prosecution's case. His testimony was the primary lens through which the investigators could understand the specific mechanisms of the extortion. He provided detailed accounts of every encounter, the specific locations where the threats were issued, and the precise, exorbitant amounts of cash demanded by the officer. The investigators worked to corroborate his story with secondary evidence, tracking movements and verifying timestamps of duty shifts, which began to reveal a pattern of behavior that was entirely inconsistent with official police conduct. Each detail Talapaga provided was subjected to rigorous cross-examination by the prosecution team before it ever reached a courtroom, ensuring that when the case was finally presented, it could withstand the inevitable, aggressive challenges from the defense. The process was a grinding, day-by-day effort to reconstruct the reality of the extortion from the fragmented, traumatic memories of a victim who was being systematically terrorized. However, the investigation hit a major wall when it began to touch upon the involvement of higher-ranking individuals. As the evidence mounted, it became increasingly apparent that Talamoni did not act in total isolation. He existed within an ecosystem of complacency. Witnesses who were initially willing to talk would suddenly become reticent, citing the pressure being placed upon them by figures within the community who held significant sway. The defense team's strategy was clearly intended to make the entire process so difficult and so politically damaging that the prosecution would simply abandon it out of exhaustion or fear of fallout. They filed endless motions, challenging the legality of every interview conducted by the Attorney General's team, and painted the entire investigation as a biased, politically motivated smear campaign against a decorated officer. The prosecutors were forced to dedicate as much time to defending their investigative process as they were to proving the actual crimes, a tactical delay that threatened to stall the momentum of the entire case. The strain of this investigation was not just professional. It was a test to the personal integrity of every attorney involved. They were facing off against a defense team that operated without moral constraints, willing to leverage any connection to shield Talamoni from accountability. The investigators had to manage the constant threat of retaliation, not through physical force, but through the professional destruction that can occur in a small community. To be a prosecutor on this case was to be an outcast, a disruptor of the status quo who was challenging the established hierarchies. Yet, they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that if this case was allowed to fail, the entire legitimacy of the American Samoan justice system would be irreparably compromised. They conducted hundreds of hours of interviews, documented every inconsistent police report, and meticulously cataloged the series of events that demonstrated Talamoni's clear intent to deceive, threaten, and exploit. The investigation reached a critical juncture when they finally secured the evidence necessary to link the extortion to the specific threats of fabricated evidence. This was the most difficult element to prove, as it required showing that Talamoni was not merely failing to perform his duties, but was actively creating false narratives to serve his private interests. By comparing the initial, honest findings of his subordinates against the final, distorted reports that Talamoni personally filed, the investigators were able to illustrate a clear trajectory of corruption. It was a smoking gun. It proved that Talamoni had deliberately manipulated the evidence to create a fictitious criminal liability for Talapaga. This discovery effectively neutralized the defense's argument that Talamoni was simply a rigorous investigator. It showcased a man who was not hunting for justice, but hunting for leverage. The revelation was both a massive breakthrough and a source of profound institutional shame, as it forced the department to acknowledge that their own procedures had been used to facilitate a crime of this magnitude. As the case moved toward trial, the investigation had successfully transformed from a series of disparate allegations into a coherent, evidence-based indictment of a corrupt officer and the toxic culture that enabled him. The prosecutors had navigated a minefield of obstruction, witness tampering, and political pressure to reach a point where the evidence spoke for itself. They had maintained their objectivity in the face of intense intimidation and had provided a voice for a victim who had been effectively silenced by the power of a badge. The investigation was not perfect, and it was certainly not easy, but it was thorough. It revealed the chilling truth that a police officer could systematically dismantle the life of an ordinary citizen using the very tools of law enforcement. It was a victory of due process over the corrupt, informal systems of control that had long governed the island shadows. The work done during this phase provided the foundation for the final confrontation in the courtroom, an environment where the arrogance of the perpetrator would finally be challenged by the facts he so recklessly sought to manipulate. Every subpoena served, every document analyzed, and every witness coached was a piece of the architecture of justice, a structure built to hold up under the immense pressure of a society in the process of grappling with its own internal demons. The investigation had done its job. It had stripped away the uniform and the false authority to reveal the cold, calculated greed of King Talamoni. The courtroom, often hailed as the cathedral of justice, became a crucible of absolute intensity during the trial of King Talamoni. It was not merely a debate over the facts of a single extortion case. It was a public reckoning with the nature of authority in American Samoa. The atmosphere inside the chamber was suffocating, thick with the weight of expectation and the lingering bitterness of a divided community. On one side sat the prosecutors, representing the state's commitment to restoring order and integrity, and on the other sat the defense, a phalanx of legal counsel whose primary objective was to cast doubt on every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every conclusion drawn by the government. The judge presided over a space where the rules of evidence were the only barriers against an all-consuming chaos, managing a process that was constantly threatened by the influence and the shadow of the accused's long-standing institutional ties. For the jury, the trial was an overwhelming experience, as they were asked to judge a man who had, until recently, been a symbol of the very law they were now evaluating. The presentation of the prosecution's case was a calculated, methodical dismantling of Talamoni's defense. They began with the testimony of Mata Talapaga, whose presence on the stand was the emotional center of the trial. The prosecutors walked him through every agonizing step of his ordeal, from the initial, menacing visits by the officer to the specific, terrifying ultimatums that had stripped him of his financial security and his peace of mind. Talapaga's testimony was raw and unflinching. He described the way Talamoni carried himself, the cold, predatory confidence that came from knowing he possessed the power to destroy a life with a single, falsified report. Under direct examination, the narrative became undeniable. It was not a story of professional duty but one of predatory exploitation, a clear-cut case of an officer who had abandoned his sworn oath to become a landlord of fear. Every detail, from the specific demands for thousands of dollars to the explicit, chilling warnings about the creation of false evidence, was laid bare for the jury to witness. The defense, true to their strategy of attrition and obstruction, countered with a relentless cross-examination. They did not attempt to deny that interactions had occurred. Instead, they attempted to recontextualize them as aggressive, albeit flawed, police work. They grilled Talapaga on the smallest discrepancies in his timeline, seeking to undermine his credibility by portraying his trauma as confusion. They argued that the money demanded was not a bribe, but a misunderstanding, a clumsy attempt to secure resources for an investigation that was hampered by poor internal documentation. It was a desperate performance, one that relied on the hope that if they could make the jury doubt even one minor aspect of the victim's memory, the entire case against the corrupt officer would unravel. The courtroom drama was amplified by the constant interventions of the defense, who moved to strike testimonies, challenged the admissibility of documents, and attempted to disqualify the prosecution's expert witnesses. Every day was an exhausting battle for every inch of ground, with the prosecutors laboring to keep the focus on the central, unassailable truth of the extortion. As the trial progressed, the prosecution introduced the evidence they had meticulously gathered, the logs of police activity, the conflicting reports, and the testimony of those who had witnessed the shift in Talamoni's behavior. The most damning moments came when the prosecutors demonstrated the discrepancies between the initial findings of the investigation and the doctor versions that Talamoni had officially submitted. These side-by-side comparisons were the death knell for the defense's narrative of a hard-working officer. They revealed the premeditation behind his actions, the clear intent to use his position to fabricate a reality where Talapaga was a criminal worthy of incarceration. The jury saw, in black and white, the evidence of an officer who had tampered with the system to serve his own private greed. This visual representation of corruption was impossible to ignore, and the collective realization of the courtroom shifted visibly as the defense's arguments began to appear not just weak, but intentionally deceptive. The battle for the jury's hearts and minds was further complicated by the political pressure permeating the courtroom. It was known that the defense was actively trying to leverage connections to sway public opinion and cast the prosecution as an overreaching body intent on damaging a veteran. Yet, the strength of the evidence proved too formidable to be obscured by these peripheral maneuvers. The prosecutors maintained their composure, sticking to the facts with a rigor that demonstrated their dedication to the truth. They avoided the temptation to match the defense's aggression, choosing instead to let the weight of the documented crimes speak for itself. In their closing arguments, the prosecutors delivered a powerful, final statement that resonated throughout the room. They reminded the jury that the badge was a contract, an agreement that the officer would be a protector, not a predator. They argued that by extorting a citizen, Talamoni had not just broken the law, he had broken the promise of the entire justice system. They emphasized the necessity of a verdict that would stand as a firm declaration that no one, regardless of their rank or their uniform, is above the law. The jury's deliberation was in a period of intense suspense, a quiet in the storm that had engulfed the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, the community waited, aware that the verdict would be a definitive point in the island's history. When the jury returned to deliver their findings, the courtroom was perfectly still. The verdict was a clear, unambiguous affirmation of the prosecution's case. Talamoni was found guilty of corruption, abuse of office, and extortion. The outcome was a monumental victory for justice, a decisive rejection of the culture of impunity that had protected him for so long. For those who had worked to bring the case to fruition, the relief was profound. They had successfully navigated the corruption, the intimidation, and the relentless procedural obstacles to hold a powerful figure accountable. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was a mixture of solemnity and resolve. King Talamoni was stripped of his uniform, his title, and his authority, a transition that marked the end of his predatory power. His sentence was a reflection of the severity of his crimes, a punishment that underscored the breach of trust he had committed against the public he was meant to serve. He was sent to prison, moving from the role of the orchestrator of incarceration to the role of the inmate, an irony that did not escape the notice of the public. The conviction was not merely a personal downfall, it was an institutional reset. By holding Talamoni responsible, the system had taken the first necessary step toward purging its own internal rot. The trial served as a cathartic experience for the entire legal community, an admission that the system was imperfect but capable of self-correction when individuals had the courage to fight for the truth. In the final analysis, the trial of King Talamoni demonstrated that the power of the law, when wielded with integrity and persistence, is far greater than the influence of any single corrupt individual. The courtroom, which had been the site of such intense combat, eventually became a place of restoration. The evidence had been clear, the trial had been fair, and the verdict had been just. The story did not end with the sentencing. It ended with the realization that the system had passed its ultimate test. The case of King Talamoni would go down in history not for its complexity, but for its fundamental clarity, a simple, terrifying tale of a predator caught in his own web, and a justice system that had finally found the strength to hold its own agents to the highest possible standard of conduct. The verdict served as a warning to all who might believe that their position of authority grants them the right to exploit others. It was a firm reminder that the badge is not an instrument of personal benefit, but a burden of immense public trust that must be guarded with absolute vigilance. Justice had been done, and the foundation of the law in American Samoa was for the first time in many years on the path to being truly solid again. The conviction and sentencing of King Talamoni were not merely the conclusion of a singular criminal case. They serve as the seismic event that forced American Samoa to confront the fragile architecture of its own justice system. As the dust settled in the courtroom and the reality of the disgraced officer's imprisonment took hold, the deeper, more painful task of reflection began. This was not a moment for celebration, but a somber reckoning with how an institution entrusted with the protection of citizens could allow such a deep, predatory rot to take root within its ranks. The case of 1994 became an indelible stain on the history of the local police department, a cautionary tale that would be revisited in legal classrooms and community town halls for decades to come. It exposed the terrifying reality of what happens when a community stops holding those in power to the same standard as the average citizen, and it forced a long-overdue conversation about the necessity of absolute transparency and rigorous, independent oversight in law enforcement. In the immediate wake of the verdict, the political and administrative response was rapid, fueled by the intense public pressure generated by the trial. The government of American Samoa found itself in the unenviable position of having to justify how such a blatant exploitation of power could have occurred under its watch. The systemic corruption that Talamoni had thrived within was no longer a secret, and the demand for reform became the singular focus of the public discourse. The administration was forced to initiate a comprehensive, top-to-bottom audit of police procedures, specifically focusing on the internal mechanisms that managed investigations. The focus shifted from merely punishing a bad actor to identifying the cultural and structural failures that had permitted Talamoni to treat his badge as a license for extortion. This involved rewriting protocols for case management, establishing independent review boards that functioned outside the influence of senior officers, and implementing stricter reporting lines to ensure that no single individual could maintain exclusive control over a criminal case from initiation to conclusion. The reforms that emerged from this period were not merely cosmetic. They were intended to be a firewall against the kind of unchecked authority that had empowered Talamoni. The establishment of internal affairs protocols that operated with a degree of separation from the rest of the force was a direct reaction to the blue wall of silence that had initially protected the accused. The legal community, too, underwent a significant transformation. Law schools and firms began to incorporate the Talamoni case into their curricula, using it as a case study for the dangers of prosecutorial misconduct and the importance of vigorous defense against unethical law enforcement behavior. The case taught a new generation of lawyers that the fight for justice is never truly won. It is a constant, vigilant effort to guard against the encroachment of power into the lives of the vulnerable. It highlighted the essential role of the whistleblower, the attorney, and the concerned citizen in maintaining the health of a democracy. The lesson was clear. The system is only as honest as the people who are willing to demand that it stays that way. The human element of this aftermath remains the most haunting aspect of the legacy left by the case. Mata Talapaga, the citizen who had been the target of the extortion, became a symbol of both the vulnerability of the individual and the incredible courage required to stand against systemic abuse. His life had been irrevocably altered by the psychological toll of the extortion and the trauma of the subsequent legal battle. His experience served as a persistent reminder to the authorities that they are not just dealing with abstract cases or bureaucratic files. They're dealing with the lives of people who are counting on the system to be a source of security, not a source of terror. The community's relationship with the police force changed as well. There was a newfound skepticism, a healthy level of doubt that replaced the former dangerous deference. This, in many ways, was the healthiest outcome of the entire ordeal. It moved the society toward a more mature relationship with law enforcement, one based on accountability rather than the unquestioned sanctity of a uniform. Yet, even with these reforms, the scars left by the Talamoni case remained visible. The memory of a police officer using the threat of fabricated evidence to demand thousands of dollars is not something that simply fades away. It left the public with a lingering question about what other incidents might have gone unreported, how many other victims had paid the price for their freedom because they feared that the system would not listen. This uncertainty created a perpetual pressure on the police department to prove its worthiness every single day. The Talamoni effect became a shorthand for institutional vigilance, a reminder that the erosion of ethics can happen in the blink of an eye if there is no one watching the gate. The case effectively ended the era of comfortable, unchallenged police dominance in American Samoa and ushered in an era defined by the necessity of constant monitoring and the courage to challenge authority when it deviates from the law. Looking back from the vantage point of history, the case stands as a monument to the dangers of absolute power. It is a reminder that the most dangerous threats to a stable society are often the ones that operate from within, disguised by the very institutions meant to secure our safety. The story of King Talamoni is not just a true crime account. It is a profound lesson in the mechanics of governance. It teaches us that the law is not a self-executing machine. It is a fragile creation that requires the active, tireless participation of every citizen to function correctly. If we fail to question, if we fail to investigate, if we fail to hold our representatives accountable, we invite the kind of predation that Talamoni embodied. The nightmare of 1994, in its horrific clarity, provided the roadmap for a more robust, more honest, and more accountable legal future for the territory. The legacy of the case is ultimately one of resilience. The system, though severely damaged and deeply flawed, was able to correct itself. It was able to discard the corrupt element within its ranks and attempt to build a stronger foundation for the future. That is the true value of the legal struggle we have examined. It proves that despite the overwhelming odds, despite the obstruction, and despite the culture of complicity, the truth can still be brought to light. It is a testament to the fact that justice, while often delayed and always difficult to obtain, remains the only acceptable outcome for a society that values the rights of its members. The story of King Talamoni serves as a perpetual, chilling, and vital warning. We must always be the ones who hold the mirror up to those in power, ensuring that they reflect the justice they are sworn to serve and not the shadows of their own desires. By doing so, we honor the memory of those who were victimized, and we safeguard the future of the communities they represent. The final chapter of this case is not written in the sentencing records or the law books, but in the ongoing, daily commitment of the people of American Samoa to never again let the nightmare of unchecked corruption become their reality. This is the ultimate lesson of the Talamoni affair, a lesson that every generation must learn, for the price of freedom is, and always will be, eternal, unwavering vigilance against the abuse of the powers we have granted to the few in trust for the benefit of the many. The law remains, but the lesson of the man who tried to break it has been etched into the history of the land, a permanent reminder of the stakes involved when we allow the rule of law to be replaced by the rule of the predator. Through this tragedy, the system found its strength, and through the exposure of the dark, the light of accountability finally reached the corners that had remained in the shadows for far too long. The final chapter of the King Talamoni saga is less about the man himself and more about the enduring ripples his actions left upon the cultural and legal landscape of American Samoa. When we analyze the aftermath, we must consider the profound shift in the psychological contract between the police and the public. Before 1994, there existed a certain reverence for the badge that bordered on the unconditional. Officers were viewed as extensions of the communal order, pillars of the society that required a baseline level of respect and trust. Talamoni's betrayal shattered this paradigm, replacing it with a nuanced, often skeptical understanding of what it means to be protected. The community realized that the uniform does not confer an inherent morality upon the wearer, and this revelation changed the way every citizen interacted with law enforcement. It introduced a necessary barrier of caution, a realization that the power granted to the police is a dangerous, sharp instrument that must be handled with constant, careful scrutiny. This societal evolution was the most significant, albeit painful, outcome of the ordeal. As the years progressed, the legal repercussions of the case continued to inform the development of local jurisprudence. The Talamoni precedent became a cornerstone for arguments regarding the suppression of evidence gained through coercion or misconduct. It forced the judiciary to adopt a more aggressive stance in reviewing the credibility of police testimonies and the origins of forensic evidence presented in criminal trials. Judges became significantly more active in questioning the investigative history of cases, requiring a higher burden of proof to ensure that the methods used to secure evidence were beyond reproach. This evolution in the courtroom served to empower defense attorneys, giving them the tools to expose potential corruption more effectively and creating a safer environment for citizens who found themselves on the wrong side of an investigation. The legacy of the case is thus embedded in the very procedures that now govern the trial process, serving as a permanent procedural guardrail against the type of predatory manipulation that Talamoni utilized. Beyond the formal legal structures, the case also influenced the professional identity of the police force itself. The department underwent a painful period of introspection, which eventually led to a redefinition of what it meant to be a police officer in the territory. The culture of silence, which had allowed Talamoni to operate for so long, was systematically challenged by new internal standards that incentivized transparency and ethical reporting. The department began to prioritize diversity of perspective and external oversight to prevent the formation of insular cliques that could protect their own from accountability. This was a slow, deliberate process, characterized by the gradual infusion of modern training protocols and the empowerment of a new generation of officers who viewed themselves as public servants first and enforcers second. The memory of the Talamoni scandal acted as a constant, quiet warning to new recruits, a ghost in the machine that served to remind them of the fragile nature of their professional reputation and the catastrophic cost of losing the public's trust. We must also reflect on the life of Mata Talapaga, who endured the trauma of being hunted by the very system he expected to protect him. His story represents the immense burden placed on the individual when the machinery of the state turns against them. The courage required for him to step forward, to document the threats, and to participate in the prosecution of a respected officer cannot be overstated. He became an accidental champion for the rights of all citizens, proving that even against the weight of a uniform, the truth remains a potent force. His experience highlights the necessity of witness protection and support systems that go beyond the purely legal, addressing the psychological impact of being victimized by those in power. His ordeal emphasizes that justice is not just a result of a guilty verdict, but a process that must include the restoration of the victim's dignity and the acknowledgement of the harm they were forced to endure. The resilience of the victim is the true measure of a society's commitment to fairness. Furthermore, the Talamoni affair serves as a profound historical lesson for other small, insular communities that struggle with the balance of power. It illustrates the danger of familiarity, where personal relationships and social hierarchies can often blur the lines of professional conduct. In an environment where everyone knows everyone, the temptation to use one's status for personal gain is a constant, subtle pressure. The Talamoni case proves that this pressure can only be neutralized by strict, impersonal application of the law, regardless of the individual's social standing or history of service. It warns that in the absence of absolute procedural integrity, the proximity of power will inevitably lead to the degradation of justice. This is a universal truth, a warning that remains relevant to every jurisdiction that values the rule of law over the rule of the influential. The case is a permanent anchor, reminding us that no matter how small or close-knit a society may be, the law must always be the highest authority. In the final, contemplative view, the story of King Talamoni is a testament to the fact that evil is rarely explosive. It is often mundane, bureaucratic, and systematic. It thrives in the gaps where no one is looking and in the shadows where we assume everything is in order. It is a reminder that we are all responsible for the health of our institutions, and that silence in the face of observed corruption is a form of complicity. The legacy of this case is not defined by the crimes that occurred, but by the public's eventual refusal to accept them. The moment the community decided that Talamoni's actions were unacceptable was the moment that the justice system began to repair itself. This decision is the ultimate victory of the democratic process, a collective assertion that the power we delegate to others is never absolute, and that it can be retrieved the moment it is misused. The case is a bridge between a past defined by blind trust and a future defined by informed vigilance. As we conclude this exploration, we must carry with us the understanding that the law is a living, breathing entity that changes based on our dedication to its ideals. King Talamoni, in his descent into criminality, inadvertently provided a roadmap for the strengthening of the very system he tried to corrupt. He demonstrated the failure points of our oversight, the cracks in our ethical foundations, and the vulnerabilities of our victims. By studying his fall, we have gained a clearer understanding of the work that is required to maintain a just society. We have learned that the struggle for justice is not a battle to be fought once, but a continuous effort that requires the attention and the bravery of every generation. The nightmare of 1994 was a heavy price to pay, but it resulted in a sharper, more resilient system that continues to protect the citizens of American Samoa today. The final lesson is a simple, yet powerful one. Be the light that exposes the shadows, for that is the only way to ensure that the badge remains a symbol of protection and not a mask for the predator. We are all the guardians of our own justice, and as long as we remain awake, the nightmare will never be allowed to return. The history of this case is closed, but the vigilance it demands remains open, a constant duty we owe to ourselves and to each other, ensuring that the promise of equal protection under the law is not just an ideal, but an everyday, unshakable reality for all. The enduring legacy of the King Talamoni case is fundamentally rooted in the concept of institutional memory. In the years that followed the conviction, the American Samoan legal establishment made a conscious, sustained effort to ensure that the events of 1994 did not fade into the background of history as just another sensational headline. Instead, it became a cornerstone of the professional ethos for law enforcement and legal practitioners alike. This act of remembering was not intended to dwell on the failures of the past, but to serve as a vital, pulsing reminder of the standard of conduct that is required for the survival of public trust. The case taught that institutions are only as strong as their ability to critique themselves, and that a lack of rigorous, Internal questioning is the primary precursor to the kind of moral decay that Talamoni embodied. This commitment to memory fostered a culture where the badge became a symbol of service that was constantly being earned, rather than an inheritance of unquestioned authority. The ongoing professional development for officers in the territory now places significant emphasis on the ethical hazards of power, using the Talamoni precedent as a tangible example of how easily a career can be destroyed by the choice to prioritize personal gain over public duty. The ripple effects of this case also extended into the political sphere, where the demand for a more accountable government became a driving force in local governance. The exposure of how Talamoni was shielded by a network of influence forced legislators to re-examine the structure of the police department's leadership, ultimately leading to policies that demanded greater transparency in the appointment and oversight of high-ranking law enforcement officials. The goal was to eliminate the possibility of a single person or a small group of individuals maintaining too much control over the machinery of the justice system. By democratizing the oversight process and involving more stakeholders in the assessment of police performance, the territory moved toward a system that was far more resistant to the type of corruption that flourished in the early 90s. This shift in the political landscape highlights how a single, well-documented failure of justice can serve as a catalyst for systemic change that lasts for generations. It showed the public that their voices, when raised in unison to demand accountability, have the power to reshape the very foundations of the state. Furthermore, the academic study of this case has had a lasting impact on the way law and justice are taught to the younger generation in American Samoa. It is no longer possible to discuss the history of the territorial justice system without addressing the Talamoni affair, which now stands as a central case study in courses on criminal procedure and legal ethics. Students are encouraged to analyze the psychology of the perpetrator, the vulnerability of the victim, and the structural failures of the investigative process. This pedagogical approach serves to immunize the next generation of legal professionals against the same complacency that allowed the corruption to fester for so long. By dissecting the case in such detail, educators are cultivating a mindset of skepticism and vigilance, training students to recognize the subtle indicators of abuse of power before they escalate into full-blown criminality. This commitment to academic honesty ensures that the memory of the case remains active and that the lessons learned from it are constantly being integrated into the training of the future guardians of the law. The technological and procedural advancements in the years following the case also played a role in mitigating the risks of similar occurrences. The move toward digital record keeping, the implementation of more robust evidence handling protocols, and the expansion of internal monitoring software have all made it significantly harder for an individual to manipulate the facts of a case, as Talamoni once did. Every document filed, every piece of evidence processed, and every communication between investigators is now subject to a level of scrutiny that would have been unimaginable in 1994. These modern protections act as a technological shield against the kind of systemic fraud that was the hallmark of Talamoni's extortion scheme. While technology alone cannot eliminate human error or malice, it provides the tools for transparency that make it much easier to detect and respond to suspicious behavior in real time. This modernization of the system is the practical manifestation of the promise made to the public after the conviction, that the infrastructure of justice would be reinforced against all forms of internal threat. Reflecting on the psychological scars of the case, we see that the community has reached a state of mature understanding regarding the limits of authority. There is a healthy skepticism that governs the interaction between the public and the police, a skepticism that is not rooted in cynicism, but in a realistic appreciation of the human element in law enforcement. Citizens are more informed about their rights, more proactive in documenting their encounters with authorities, and more comfortable in utilizing the channels for reporting misconduct. This shift in the public's approach to interacting with the state is perhaps the most significant cultural outcome of the case. It has created a partnership between the community and the law, where the police are viewed as facilitators of safety rather than arbiters of truth. This balance of power is essential for a healthy society, and it was achieved through the painful experience of witnessing the ultimate breakdown of that balance. The narrative of King Talamoni, while dark, is ultimately a story of redemption for the institutions that eventually held him to account. It demonstrates the capacity for a system to turn away from its own worst impulses and rediscover its core commitment to fairness. It validates the struggles of the individuals, the prosecutors, the investigators, and the witnesses who put their own comfort and professional standing at risk to see the truth revealed. They were the ones who refused to accept the status quo, and their determination serves as a blueprint for anyone who finds themselves facing a similar injustice. Their collective effort reminds us that the fight for a just society is a cumulative process, where each generation builds upon the progress of the last, constantly refining the systems and standards that hold power accountable. It is a slow, often grueling journey, but is the only one that leads toward a future where the rule of law is an ironclad reality rather than an abstract ideal. In conclusion, the story of King Talamoni will forever remain a central node in the history of American Samoa's justice system, a point of reference that separates a past of blind trust from a future of informed accountability. It is a narrative that challenges us to look beyond the surface of what we are told and to understand the mechanisms of power that govern our lives. It teaches us that the preservation of justice is not the responsibility of a few, but the collective duty of everyone who participates in the society. By remembering the lessons of this case, we acknowledge that the potential for corruption is a constant, and that our only defense against it is an unwavering, active, and public insistence on the integrity of our institutions. The case closed in the courtroom, but it lives on in the ongoing practice of justice, in the vigilant eyes of the citizens, and in the high standards that continue to define the professional life of the territory. It is a story that has been fully told, yet its impact remains felt every day, a silent, powerful influence that shapes the way we think about authority, justice, and the fundamental rights of every human being to be treated with honesty, fairness, and the dignity that the law is meant to protect. This final reflection underscores that the true victory was not merely the imprisonment of a corrupt officer, but the collective decision by an entire society to never again allow the shadows to grow long enough to conceal the truth, ensuring that the light of justice remains the guiding principle for all who live under the protection of the law. The resonance of the King Talamoni affair extends far beyond the borders of American Samoa, serving as a grim but essential testament to the global reality of police corruption and the fragility of judicial integrity. When we step back to examine the broader implications of this case, we are forced to confront the universal nature of the struggle between the rule of law and the impulses of those who seek to manipulate it for personal gain. Talamoni's actions were not a localized anomaly, but rather a manifestation of a deeply ingrained danger that exists in any jurisdiction where the power of the badge is not tempered by the force of independent oversight. This narrative serves as a diagnostic tool for other societies, a set of warning signs to identify the early onset of institutional decay. It highlights the critical importance of a vigilant citizenry and an empowered press, both of which are the primary antibodies against the infection of systemic corruption. Without these external pressures, the internal structures of law enforcement are inherently prone to the kind of cronyism and abuse that Talamoni weaponized. As we continue to reflect on the 9 segments of this investigative journey, it becomes clear that the case was as much about the silence of the witnesses as it was about the criminality of the perpetrator. The blue wall of silence is perhaps the most significant hurdle in any case of police misconduct, and the Talamoni trial demonstrated just how difficult it is to penetrate this barrier. The fact that the prosecution succeeded in overcoming this wall is a testament to the courage of those individuals who chose to break the code of silence in favor of a higher ethical obligation. It suggests that the culture of an institution is not fixed. It is a fluid environment that can be shifted when the internal incentives for truth-telling are elevated above the incentives for protectionism. This realization is crucial for any reform movement, as it identifies the need to create mechanisms that reward officers for reporting misconduct rather than punishing them for betraying their colleagues. The Talamoni case proved that when the system finally decides to enforce its own rules, the facade of untouchability that surrounds corrupt actors begins to crack with remarkable speed. The psychological impact of such a case on the public trust is a wound that takes generations to heal. When a community discovers that the people they have tasked with their safety have been actively planning their exploitation, the damage is not just limited to the victim. It is a collective trauma that redefines the social compact. For the people of American Samoa, this required a complete reevaluation of their relationship with the state. The skepticism that followed the trial was not a sign of failing society, but a sign of a society becoming more conscious and, therefore, more resilient. It is the hallmark of a mature democracy that the public does not provide blind support to its institutions, but rather conditional support based on the consistent demonstration of integrity. By turning this skepticism into a constructive force for oversight, the people of the territory ensured that the Talamoni legacy would be one of transformation rather than resignation. They refused to let their disappointment descend into cynicism, choosing instead to engage more deeply in the oversight of their own governance. Looking toward the future, the lessons of the Talamoni case must continue to be integrated into the foundational training of all public servants. It is not enough to teach the law. One must also teach the moral weight of the law. Officers should be trained to understand that their authority is a temporary loan from the public, and that any attempt to misappropriate that power for personal gain is a betrayal of the most fundamental level. This ethical training needs to be bolstered by systems that are designed to be corruption-resistant. This means creating decentralized processes for evidence management, audit trails that are accessible to independent observers, and clear, safe pathways for whistleblowers to report concerns. These are the structural defenses that we must build to ensure that no individual can ever again assume the role of an absolute arbiter of fate, as Talamoni attempted to do. The goal is to build a system where the process of justice is so robust that the personal desires of the people operating it become irrelevant. In assessing the role of the legal professionals involved in this saga, we see the absolute necessity of a fearless and well-resourced prosecution team. They were the ones who stood in the breach, absorbing the pressure and the intimidation, and refusing to let the case be buried in the bureaucracy of the defense. Their success was not just a win for the victim, but a win for the entire judicial process. It showed that the law, when wielded by those who are truly committed to its tenets, is a formidable force that can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The defense, in their attempts to delay, confuse, and intimidate, only highlighted the strength of the truth they were trying to obscure. This is a vital lesson for all legal systems. When a case becomes a battle of attrition, the side that is anchored to the truth will always have the advantage if they possess the stamina to withstand the pressure. The prosecutors in the Talamoni case demonstrated that stamina, and in doing so, they provided a model for all who seek to hold the powerful accountable. Finally, we must recognize that the case of King Talamoni serves as a mirror for our own societal values. It asks us what kind of justice we are willing to settle for. Are we content with a system that is efficient, even if it is corrupt? Or do we demand a system that is transparent, even if it is occasionally slow and cumbersome? The answer to this question determines the quality of our collective life. The Talamoni affair forced the territory to move toward a more transparent model of justice, and this journey is one that all societies must embark upon if they wish to remain truly free. The case was a wake-up call, a jarring reminder that the comfort of the status quo is often the most dangerous environment in which to live. It is only through the active, painful, and necessary work of confronting our internal failures that we can move toward a more equitable future. This is the ultimate, enduring value of the story we have told. As we put this narrative to rest, we do so with a deeper understanding of the high stakes involved in the governance of justice. The story of King Talamoni, from its opening moments of predatory deception to its final days of judicial reckoning, remains a cornerstone of the legal history of the island. It is a story that refuses to be ignored, precisely because it touches upon the most sensitive and essential aspects of our democratic experience. It reminds us that power, when left to its own devices, will naturally seek to expand and protect itself. It is only when that power is constrained by the law, and when the law is guarded by the people, that it can serve its intended purpose. The Talamoni case was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a triumph of the process over the predator. It stands as a beacon for all who believe in the necessity of justice, a beacon that burns with the steady, unwavering light of accountability. We are the stewards of this justice, and as long as we keep the lessons of 1994 at the forefront of our collective memory, we will continue to build a society where the badge is always, and without question, a symbol of protection for everyone. The nightmare is long over, but the watch must continue, for the price of a just society is, and shall always be, our constant, unwavering attention to the health of the institutions we have built to serve us. By remaining vigilant, by speaking out against the small injustices before they become large ones, and by demanding that our officials live up to the highest standards, we honor the memory of those who were affected and we ensure the stability of the future. The story of King Talamoni is now our guide, a compass pointing us away from the darkness of the past and toward a future defined by the enduring, unshakable integrity of the law. As we draw the final curtain on the saga of King Talamoni, we find ourselves standing in the clearing left by a storm that once threatened to tear the foundations of the American Samoan justice system asunder. Looking back across these 10 detailed explorations, we recognize that this narrative is far more than a mere account of a corrupt official's fall from grace. It is a profound meditation on the nature of civic responsibility, the vulnerability of the individual, and the unrelenting necessity of the rule of law. We have traced the arc of this tragedy from the moment a badge was first used as a weapon to the courtroom, where it was finally reclaimed. And in doing so, we have uncovered the essential truth that an institution is not an abstract entity. It is a living collection of decisions, ethics, and moments of courage, or cowardice, made by the human beings who inhabit it. The Talamoni affair demonstrated that the most effective, most dangerous, and most vital element within any system is the individual conscience. The path toward accountability in this case was not a paved highway. It was a rugged, uphill climb against the weight of institutional inertia and the suffocating presence of entrenched influence. That the prosecution and investigative team were able to navigate this terrain serves as a lesson in the power of professional integrity. They were the catalysts of change, the individuals who refused to look away when the evidence of corruption became undeniable. Their persistence reminds us that justice is rarely the default outcome. It is something that must be built, defended, and fought for at every turn. When they stood up against the defense's tactics, they were not just prosecuting a man. They were upholding the very integrity of the judicial process. This stands as a powerful testament to the fact that when individuals within a system commit themselves to the truth, they can dismantle even the most complex webs of deceit and protect the rights of the innocent from those who would prey upon them. We must also continue to hold the memory of Mata Talapaga in the foreground of our consciousness. His ordeal was the catalyst that forced the system to look into the mirror, and his resilience is the ultimate hero of this story. Without his willingness to expose the extortion, the predatory cycle would have continued, perhaps growing more brazen and destructive with each passing victim. Talapaga represents the millions of citizens across the globe who, in their own quiet and often overlooked ways, push back against the abuse of power. His story emphasizes that a society's health is measured not by how it treats its powerful, but by how it protects its most vulnerable. The trauma he experienced was real, and it was devastating, yet it was also the foundation upon which the territory built a new commitment to fairness. His legacy is one of silent strength, a reminder that the cost of justice is often borne by the individual, but the benefit of that justice is shared by the entire community. As we move forward, the Talamoni case must continue to serve as a compass for policy and ethics and governance. The reforms that were implemented, the enhanced oversight, the transparency mandates, and the cultural shifts are not static monuments to be admired, but dynamic commitments that must be renewed by every succeeding generation. We must ensure that the institutional memory of 1994 remains vibrant and accessible. This means resisting the urge to simplify or sanitize the history of the case, but rather engaging with its discomforting realities. We must ask the hard questions. Are our current systems truly resistant to such corruption? Do we have the mechanisms to catch an officer who decides to abuse their power today? Are we empowering our whistleblowers, or are we still expecting them to pay the price for our collective safety? These questions are the essential nourishment for a healthy justice system. The broader lesson for our global community is that no institution is immune to the temptation of unchecked power. The mechanisms of democracy, the press, the independent judiciary, the transparent legislative process are the only reliable defenses against the rise of the predator. We are all participants in this governance, whether we occupy a high office or we are merely observing from the sidelines. Our vigilance is the lifeblood of the law. When we see an injustice, our silence is a form of approval. When we see a wrong, our refusal to address it is a form of complicity. The story of Talamoni proves that even the most respected systems can fail, and that the only thing standing between a functioning society and a predatory state is our collective willingness to act. It is a sobering, yet empowering realization. It places the power of justice squarely back into our hands. In our final reflection, we must embrace the idea that the law is not merely a set of rules, but a mirror reflecting our highest values. When we allow that mirror to be clouded by corruption or shattered by the arrogance of the few, we lose sight of who we are as a people. The process of scrubbing that mirror, of holding Talamoni to account, was the process of reclaiming the identity of the community. It was a reaffirmation that in this society, justice is not a commodity to be purchased by the wealthy or manipulated by the powerful. It is the fundamental promise made to every citizen, regardless of their status or their situation. This is the promise that we must keep day after day, year after year. The case is closed, the files are archived, and the players have moved on, but the spirit of the reform continues. It lives on in every courtroom, in every police station, and in every home that relies on the protection of the law. We conclude this exploration with a sense of guarded optimism. The nightmare of Talamoni taught us to fear the darkness, but the conviction of Talamoni taught us to trust in the light. We have seen that while the systems we create are imperfect, they possess the latent potential for profound transformation. The story of this island territory is now a part of the global narrative of justice, a beacon of what is possible when a community chooses integrity over convenience. We carry the lessons of this case with us not as a burden, but as a map for navigating the challenges of the future. We know that the fight for justice is never-ending, that the temptations of power will always exist, and that the duty of the citizenry is never truly completed. But we also know that we have the strength to rise to that challenge. We have the courage to demand better, and we have the capacity to build systems that reflect our best selves rather than our worst fears. As the echoes of the Talamoni trial fade into the annals of history, we remain the stewards of the future. The standard has been set, the lessons have been learned, and the commitment has been made. We stand together, committed to a future where the badge is always a source of safety, where the law is always the ultimate authority, and where justice is always the standard by which we live. The nightmare of the past has been transformed into the vigilance of the present, and that vigilance will serve as the foundation of our stability for the days to come. May we always be brave enough to look into the shadows, smart enough to recognize the dangers, and strong enough to keep our institutions pure. The story of King Talamoni ends here, but the mission of justice goes on, carried forward by the people who believe that, no matter the cost, the truth is worth the search. Our history is written, but our future is ours to build, defined by the enduring, unshakable integrity of the law we hold in trust for all those who follow. This is our promise, this is our duty, and this is our hope for a world that deserves the best of what we can provide, one day at a time, through our commitment to a justice that is blind to power and clear in its devotion to the people. As we embark upon this 11th movement in our comprehensive examination of the King Talamoni affair, we are compelled to look beyond the immediate legal outcomes and toward the profound metaphysical shift that the case triggered within the collective consciousness of the American Samoan populace. It is not sufficient to merely recount the details of the investigation or the drama of the courtroom. We must instead grapple with the lasting philosophical weight of what occurs when the instruments of justice are weaponized against the very people they are sworn to protect. This case functions as a permanent fixture in the landscape of local memory, a monument to the dangerous interplay between human fallibility and institutional authority. It forces a contemplation of the social contract, a realization that the legitimacy of the state rests entirely upon the integrity of its agents. When an officer like Talamoni violates this trust, he does not just commit a crime. He commits a fundamental breach of the faith that allows a civilized society to function, creating a rupture that requires generations of consistent, ethical behavior to finally mend. The narrative of this scandal has, over the decades, evolved into a form of cautionary folklore, a story passed down to ensure that the complacency which enabled Talamoni's actions never again takes root. It serves as a reminder that institutional rot is a silent, creeping process that often begins with minor, seemingly insignificant lapses in judgment. The case compels us to wonder how many small compromises were made by those around Talamoni before he felt emboldened enough to attempt blatant, large-scale extortion. By engaging with this inquiry, we learn that the preservation of justice requires constant attention to the minutiae of professional conduct. It teaches that one must be vigilant not only against the predatory actions of others, but also against the temptation to excuse unethical behavior when it comes from those within our own professional or social circles. This vigilance is the true price of liberty, and the Talamoni case stands as a stark, uncompromising reminder of that cost. Furthermore, we must address the enduring question of how an individual's identity is impacted by the role they play within the machinery of the law. King Talamoni was, for years, seen as a pillar of the community, a man who possessed the trust of his neighbors and the authority of the state. The duality of his life, the respected officer and the predatory extortionist, challenges us to consider the masks that individuals wear in their professional capacities. It exposes the danger of allowing the title or the uniform to define the person, suggesting that we must always look past the surface of authority to the actions that characterize the individual. This realization has profound implications for how we vet, train, and supervise our public servants. It shifts the burden from a culture of trust based on position to a culture of verification based on conduct. This transition is essential for any society that aims to avoid the pitfalls of institutional arrogance and ensure that its power is always directed toward the service of the public good. The persistent relevance of this story also lies in its ability to highlight the essential nature of the adversarial system in discovering the truth. The trial was not merely a mechanical application of legal code. It was a human drama where the struggle for justice was fought through testimony, cross-examination, and the careful weighing of conflicting narratives. The legal professionals involved were not just technicians of the law. They were the guardians of the facts. Their success in this trial reinforces the belief that the adversarial process, despite its inherent tensions and occasional chaos, is the most effective method we have for exposing the reality of human corruption. It underscores the necessity of having a robust and independent bar that can challenge the state when it goes astray. The Talamoni trial serves as a reminder that justice is not something that is handed down by the state. It is something that must be earned through the rigorous, often grueling, exploration of the truth by all parties involved in the legal process. As we look at the systemic changes that followed the conviction, we see a shift toward a more proactive model of accountability. The introduction of independent auditing, the codification of new ethical standards, and the increased involvement of community stakeholders in the oversight of police activities all represent a fundamental change in the territory's approach to governance. These reforms are not just logistical adjustments. They are a declaration of values. They signify that the community is no longer willing to accept the passive assurance of integrity, but instead demands the active, ongoing proof of it. This shift toward a culture of evidence and accountability is perhaps the greatest triumph of the Talamoni aftermath. It creates an environment where the potential for corruption is minimized by the sheer difficulty of operating in the shadows. This is the ultimate goal of institutional reform: to build a system so transparent that even those who would seek to manipulate it find themselves unable to hide from the light. The emotional resonance of this history also continues to shape the community's empathy for the victims of institutional abuse. The suffering endured by Mata Talapaga, though occurring decades ago, remains a poignant example of the immense personal cost of challenging those in power. It encourages a more compassionate society, one that recognizes the courage it takes for an individual to speak truth to power. This empathy is a vital component of a healthy society, as it ensures that the voices of the vulnerable are not ignored when they present grievances against the state. It promotes a justice system that is not only effective at finding the truth, but also sensitive to the impact its processes have on the lives of its citizens. By validating the experience of the victim, the system reaffirms its commitment to the dignity of every person it comes into contact with, transforming the cold, administrative process of the law into a human-centric pursuit of equity. Looking toward the future, we must remain mindful of the fact that the Talamoni case is a chapter in an ongoing story, not the final word. The challenges we face in the 21st century, from the influence of digital technology to the increasing complexity of international legal standards, require us to apply the lessons of the past with a forward-looking perspective. We must ensure that our commitment to transparency keeps pace with these changes, and that we are constantly updating our defensive mechanisms to guard against new forms of institutional manipulation. The principles that were reinforced by the Talamoni affair, the necessity of checks and balances, the importance of independent oversight, and the imperative of public accountability, remain the foundation upon which all future progress must be built. We have the benefit of hindsight, and we have the duty to use that advantage to prevent the recurrence of the nightmares that were faced by those who came before us. In our final assessment, the story of King Talamoni is a testament to the resilience of the law itself. Despite the efforts of the corrupt to bend and break it, the law ultimately prevailed, demonstrating that it has the capacity to purge its own impurities and renew its commitment to its fundamental purpose. This is the enduring, hopeful conclusion of our narrative. It suggests that even in the most challenging circumstances, the structures we have created to ensure fairness possess a core of integrity that can, if supported by the right people, overcome any obstacle. The Talamoni affair did not destroy the justice system of American Samoa. Rather, it provided the fire in which that system was tempered, emerging stronger, more aware, and more committed to the service of the people. This is the legacy we carry forward, a recognition that while our institutions may falter, their fundamental purpose remains the most noble of human endeavors, and our task is to ensure they are always worthy of the trust we place in them. As we conclude this extended reflection, we are reminded that the vigilance required for justice is a lifelong commitment. Every citizen holds a stake in the integrity of our institutions, and every act of holding power to account is a contribution to the stability and the freedom of the society. We have explored the depths of a dark history to find the light of progress, and we have learned that the struggle for justice is not only worthwhile, but absolutely essential to our survival as a free people. The story of King Talamoni ends, but the story of our ongoing commitment to justice continues, written in the choices we make, the institutions we protect, and the unwavering standards we demand from those who hold the power to act on our behalf. May the lessons we have drawn from this dark chapter serve as a perpetual guiding light, ensuring that the promise of equal justice under the law remains the living, beating heart of our society, shielding us from the shadows of the past and leading us toward a future defined by the absolute, unshakable integrity of the truth. Through this sustained effort, we honor the past, we serve the present, and we secure the inheritance of those who will come after us, leaving them with a system that is not only robust, but deeply, fundamentally worthy of their unwavering, absolute, and hard-earned confidence.